o'clock. Time to get down to work. So I will call the meeting of the Strategic Initiative Standing Committee to order. Today we acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on the traditional territory of the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. We are thankful to share in the special spirit of this place, rich in the energy of Mother Earth, our ancestors, and the love of all creation. For the adoption of the agenda, the content of the Strategic Initiative Standing Committee agenda for July 16, 2019 be adopted as amended, and it's going to include a resolution that we accept or receive the auditor's report and refer it to council for approval. Deputy Mayor?
So moved.
Seconder? Councillor Hamlin, all in favor? That is carried unanimously. Any declarations of pecuniary interest today? Seeing none, if you find yourself in that position, please state for the record the nature of the conflict. We'll now move into staff reports then. 4.1, the auditor's report. I see Sue Bragg in the audience. Marjorie, I don't know if you want to say any introductory comments before Sue gets started.
No, to you, Your Worship, I was just going to say that we do have Sue in the audience to present the statement. So.
Thank you. Welcome, Ms. Bragg. You have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. I didn't used to have these when I was presiding council, but that's where I'm at now. So I think I know all of you have had a copy of the draft financial statements for a few days now, but I've done a PowerPoint presentation as well, just to provide the highlights as I see them. I don't know whether you were able to see that all the time or not. It was a late breaking, I think I sent it to Marjorie at about 4:45 yesterday, so but it's all information from the financial statements before you, certainly.
I did get it at the council this morning.
Oh, wonderful. So as you may or may not be aware, Treasury staff actually drafts the financial statements. The 2 pages that you see with the audit report is really what we create, but the financial statements themselves were drafted. Obviously, we offered assistance in terms of note disclosure and wording and things like that, but the financial statements were certainly prepared by staff of the town. And as I mentioned, these are the important highlights as I see them. My apologies, I think the draft that you received prior to the weekend did not have an audit report in it. It just had a placeholder in it, but I can assure you that the final will have an audit report in it. These financial statements are referred to as consolidated because they include all of the figures related to the library and the BIA. As you may know, the town acts as the banker for both of those entities, and we prepare separate audited financial statements for both of them because they're required for funding purposes. And in the case of the BIA, under the Municipal Act, a separate audited statement is required, and those figures are all included in this consolidated statement. The audit report will be dated July 22nd. As the Mayor mentioned, these will be received and have final approval at Monday's meeting, but today is the day that I'll go over the highlights with you, and we'll have an opportunity for questions and so on. The audit report is an unqualified opinion, as it has been in other years. And another interesting point that I always like to mention is what we found in terms of a management letter. So the audit report is part of the audited financial statement, and really the only other publication we provide to you is a management letter. And this year it includes just one point regarding controls over the water department inventory, and it's something that we've talked about with Treasury staff before. Unfortunately, given the dollars involved, it's not cost beneficial to have a stores manager in place there, but it is an area that lacks controls that we wanted to bring to everyone's attention. So on the consolidated statement of operations, you will have seen columns for each of budget, actual 2018 figures, and actual 2017 figures. And so in terms of large discrepancies and what really makes up the annual surplus. So the annual surplus for 2018 was 22.6 million. Keep in mind that this is on a PSAB basis. That figure this year includes 10.5 million from a gain on sale of the hydro shares, 6.1 million in contributed tangible capital assets, which is the assumption of the Mare Mills subdivision, and then offset by $5 million for the contaminated site, the terminal's liability that's been set up. So normalized, if we were to take out those three unusual items, the surplus would be about $11 million. Still better than last year, but certainly not the 22.6 that you see there. A couple of other variances I just wanted to highlight in the operating revenues and expenses. So net municipal taxation increased by approximately 1.6 million over the prior year and was about $1 million greater than the budget amount. And the main reason for this was related to supplementary taxes. Other revenue was also higher than both last year and budget, and that's because part of the sale of the hydro utility included $1.3 million in dividends. That was not the case and certainly wasn't budgeted last year. Under expenses, most of the categories are fairly similar year over year and compared to budget, with one large exception. So as is common with many municipalities, the town of Collingwood does not budget for amortization expense. It's an accounting allocation, it's not a cash expense. And so amortization this year was 10.7 million, last year 10.4 million. And so that is a large variance that you see compared to last year as well as budget. Sorry, not compared to last year, it's very similar to last year, but compared to budget, that's the major difference. Cash and short-term investments. You can see there was cash of about just under 65 million, investments of about 16.6 million. And one of the things that we have included in our presentation the last couple of years is some comparators to, what's the provincial average and what does the ministry think is low risk. Now, of course, there's no perfect comparator. There's no other municipality exactly like the town of Collingwood that we could compare to. But this does give you some indication. And I would caution you that in some cases, what the provincial average is, if everyone in the province is doing poorly, then that's not necessarily a good measuring stick. But it is interesting to see. Obviously, in terms of cash and short-term investments as a percentage of operating expenses, Collingwood is certainly tracking far better than both the provincial average and what the ministry considers as low risk. Taxes receivable, about 3.5 million compared to 4.2 last year. For this one, we add an extra bar. We're the auditors for 7 local municipalities, and they range in the 4 to 11% range. Collingwood's certainly at the lower end of that at 6%, which is very similar to the provincial average as well. And the ministry considers anything less than 10 as low risk. So good news there, certainly. Long-term receivables, this took a big jump this year, and so it was a number I wanted to make sure to highlight for you. If you recall, part of the sale of the Collingwood shares included an agreement that we would offset a receivable and some existing long-term debt that was in Collis. And so there's about $8 million at the end of the year in both receivables and long-term debt related to that issue. So they're equal and offsetting. The accounting rules require that we still show them separately as a receivable and a liability. But I wanted to certainly point out why that number jumped so greatly. Deferred revenue is another one that I wanted to highlight for you. So these are figures, these are items that are restricted either by an act or by a specific agreement with a government agency. Of course, the lion's share of the 24 million is almost 21 million related to the Development Charges Act. There's also 1.2 million related to the Building Code Act. There's unspent federal gas tax monies of about 1.7 million, and then there's some other smaller amounts that make up that balance. And when you If you were to look at the cash note that talks about restricted cash, those items are restricted because of these items here, this 24 million. Long-term liabilities, as I mentioned under long-term receivables, it took a big jump, and that's because of the $8 million related to Collis and Epcor. And then the new item under liabilities is the liability for a contaminated site. So the terminals has been an issue on our radar for a number of years now. And this year, when we looked at, exactly the recognition criteria for setting up a liability, we really couldn't, sitting around the management table and as auditors, it wasn't something we could ignore anymore. We've certainly set up what we think is the low end of the possibilities, and hopefully, maybe this number is too big, but it just seems to me that anytime you get into a situation like this, it's always more than you think it's than you expect it to be, despite consultants' estimates and so on. So that is set up there for the first time, and you'll see note 10B explains that fairly briefly, but certainly explains the magnitude of the possibilities that are before council and the amount that we've decided to we've agreed to set up. So when you look at the debt service payments as a percentage of revenues, we are tracking higher than the province and what the ministry considers low risk. And that 8.2 figure is consistent with last year. I think last year was 8.1. So it's not 8.2 because of the new $8 million of debt related to the Epcor Collis deal. That is where you're sitting regardless of that. So next year, that number will increase given the $8 million. This year's calculation is based on the debt service payments that were made in 2018. Obviously, 2019 will be higher because of that. Net financial assets. So this is the total financial assets minus liabilities. Note that it does not include non-financial assets, so it doesn't include tangible capital assets. And the chart looks kind of odd because the province and what the ministry considers low risk is assuming that you're going to be in a net debt position, because that liability figure includes your debt related to tangible capital assets. You're actually in a positive position, which is wonderful. And so your percent of net debt compared to the provincial average and what the ministry considers low risk is on the opposite side of the chart. Not all of my clients are in that position, but certainly the town is. Tangible capital assets. So these are the non-financial assets I referred to. So they were 210 million at the end of 2018. And keep in mind, this is an accounting figure. So this is what the original cost of the assets were, less accumulated amortization. So we've estimated the useful life of each of those items, and we're writing them off over their useful life, and our resulting net book value figure is 210. So 210 doesn't represent fair market value. It doesn't represent replacement cost. I know something that's very important to the town is an asset management plan, and those figures that you're going to see in those plans won't resemble this. This is your original cost less amortization. So the ratio that we look at here is the asset consumption ratio. So that's total accumulated amortization over total cost of tangible capital assets. So it's trying to get a sense of how much of your assets have you used up, have you consumed. And so Collingwood is very close to the provincial average, 39 versus 37, but higher than what the ministry considers low risk. So that would be an indication to the ministry that your assets are aging, and asset management plans are a really important thing to be looking at in conjunction with that. A couple of other disclosures that I wanted to bring to your attention and lines on the financial statements. So under financial assets, you saw a new line this year, assets held for sale, with a cross-reference to note 23, which is the subsequent event note. So when you've got an asset that you are selling, it's prudent to set it up as an asset held for sale. It moves out of tangible capital assets and up under financial assets because you're going to get cash for it. And so that 1.4 million basically represents the net book value of the tangible capital assets related to the airport. That's obviously not the figure that you're getting for the airport, but that's those were the asset figures at the end of 2018 that were intangible capital assets. So they're separately disclosed this year. The second item there is the portfolio investment for hydro companies. Obviously it's zero this year because it was sold during 2018. Last year that figure was there at 3.6 million. And then last but not least, another disclosure I wanted to highlight for you, and this was included in last year's financial statements as well, is that we do have a commitment note regarding the judicial inquiry, and it also gives reference to the most recent management report and where those dollar figures are coming out now that we're further along in the process. Accumulated surplus, of course, this is every year, this is where I get excited, right? This is my favorite note. Not where we should see excitement now. Accumulated surplus, note 13. So this tells us exactly what makes up our accumulated surplus. Obviously, that 241 million that you see at the bottom of the statement of financial position and the statement of operations doesn't mean cash. It's made up of a number of important components, the lion's share of which is the invested intangible capital assets, so 184 million. Of that 241 million is tied up in the bricks and mortar of the municipality. The current fund surplus this year slipped into a negative, and that's because the $5 million liability related to the terminals we've considered as part of the current fund surplus. So that's the difference there. That's, if you do the math between this year and last year, it's exactly the 5 million. And then reserves and reserve funds are just under 62 million at the end of 2018. And of course, it took a big jump because of the sale of Collis. So there's 15.5 million related to the Collis share sale that certainly wasn't there before. In terms of the ratios, so one of the ratios we look at is reserves as a percentage of operating expenses. Collingwood tracks very high. You'll notice also, interestingly enough, that the ministry considers 20% low risk, but the province is tracking closer to 70%. So I just think that's an interesting observation to make. And last but not least, this just gives you a little bit better breakdown. You see it in note 13 as well, of what all the reserves and reserve funds are. And you know, the most important highlight you see almost at the bottom of that slide is the Collis share sale, the 15.5 million, which of course didn't have a comparable figure last year. One other item on that, so there could be some confusion between why are we seeing 15.5 million here, but the statement of operations showed something like around 10.5 million. Well, we had a cost of 3.6 million that really was a notional accounting amount, so that's included here. We've also included the dividend amount of 1.3 million that was received, and then in the time since the sale, you know, the last 3 months of the year, there was about $60,000 of interest earned on that. So when you add up those four figures, you get to the 15.5. So I'd love to entertain some questions, but before I do that, I just wanted to thank Marjorie and her staff for all their help. I couldn't do it without them, both at interim and year end, and we don't just bug Marjorie. We're bugging pretty much every member of her staff has to put up with one of us. Most of them not me, but Ryan and the other folks from my office that go out, so thanks very much. Any questions?
Council, any questions for Ms. Bragg? Councillor Hamlin.
Thank you. Hi, how are you? I had two questions. One is on page 9, you talked about long-term liabilities, and I just didn't catch. So we have 8.2 as opposed. Is that considered a higher risk then? Is that a bad situation to be in?
Well, again, it depends on whether or not you think that the provincial comparators and what the ministry thinks is low risk. If those are important factors to you, then yes, the town has a higher amount that they're spending on debt repayment than those averages, yes.
Can you identify why that would be?
Not specifically. Fareed or Marjorie may chime in on this.
Through your worship, I mean, I don't know if we can identify one trigger that caused this, but this is accumulated debt over a number of years, and the cost of servicing the debt is what it is. One of our strategic goals is to try and bring that down, so we don't have to set aside so much money on an ongoing basis for to service the debt. But if you look at the totality of the fiscal picture, I mean, I think that's probably the only item where we're tracking above the provincial average of what is considered to be low risk. Everything else, we're actually way below what is considered to be low risk. So that's the one item that I think we'll have to focus on to try and bring that down, so we're not paying a significant amount to service the debt.
Oh, that's great, thank you. My other question was, at the very beginning, you talked about the management letter, lack of controls over water department inventory. I didn't understand what exactly that meant.
So every year we go and do a physical count or check on the physical count of the water department inventory. We do that. It's usually the first week of January, not over the Christmas holidays, but the first week of January we go and check that out. And where it's housed right now is an open area that anyone can walk into at any point in time and take something. There's really no physical constraints to someone accessing that inventory. And so as an asset of the municipality, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a huge number, but it is something that, as auditors, we're supposed to point out any lack of controls, that's not really minor. And so that's one area that we certainly have concerns with. But we also understand that the cost benefit of having someone sit there all day, every day to watch what comes in and out is not there. But I know that management has some different ideas about how that can get dealt with in the future, and I'm sure that will be the case.
Well, thank you for explaining that. Great report and great statements. Thanks.
Council, any other comments? I more a comment or a question for you, Sue, but I think in the last term we got from being in a net deficit situation to being in a net positive situation within the last year or two, and it's nice to see that trend has increased dramatically this year. And I guess just to follow up on Councillor Hammond's questions about the debt servicing, we have reduced our debt from approximately 39 million at the start of 2015 to around under 25 now, Marjorie. So that was a $14 million debt reduction, and I think that's putting us in good stead. But I take your comments about the asset management plan and the state of our infrastructure moving forward, so that's a bit of a red flag for us.
Yeah, you have to look at the whole picture, because if all of your assets were brand new, you'd be looking at this feeling very differently than if, there's some significant work to be done.
And thank you very much for that. And I'll let you go. And I will ask for a mover and seconder for the resolution that the Strategic Initiative Standing Committee receive the auditor's report for 2018 financial statements and refer to council for approval on July 22nd. Oh yes, it's time for public input. This is a standing committee meeting, so if there's any comments from the public, now is your opportunity to come forward. Good luck with the baseball game. Seeing none, then I will look to council. Moved by the Deputy Mayor, seconded by Councillor McLeod. Any questions or comments before I call the vote? Seeing none, then I will call the vote. All in favor? And that is carried unanimously. Moving on to item 4.2, PW 2019-15, the increased budget requested for a wastewater treatment plant. Welcome, Peggy. And I will pass the floor to you.
Okay, thank you, Your Worship. I'm just waiting for the presentation to go on. Oops. Okay, so the wastewater treatment plant has an 800 kilowatt backup generator. This is a critical piece of equipment for the site. It does provide power to key pieces of equipment during the power outage and ensures that sewage is continually moving through the plant and being treated, and receiving adequate treatment and keeping us in compliance. And it also helps manage the waste that would still be flowing through the collection system, reducing any risks of backups at residential homes or businesses. In 2015, the current generator had some unexpected major repairs, and so these were costly. And that exercise identified to us that this, as a key piece of infrastructure, that we should plan ahead and look to replacement of this piece of equipment, which was is aging, and look to do this proactively before we had some kind of critical unplanned failure. So, So this capital asset replacement was added to our 5-year budget. In 2018, we did a load assessment on the wastewater plant, and this helped us identify what size of generator we would need moving forward. We did this because we knew with the new UV equipment in particular, we were looking at a reduction of required power, a backup power, and this was the case. We found that we could reduce the size of the generator 600 kilowatt, so that was good news for us. And we also were confident that we'd be able to use the existing structure and move forward with this. So based on that assessment, we had a preliminary estimate for the replacement of the generator, which we included in the 2019 budget. Following or entering into the new year, 2019, we completed detailed design through our engineering roster, and during this detailed design, we identified some constructability elements and which increased the scope of the project. So the design was still able to utilize the structure in the building and work with some of the components, but some of the electrical and mechanical components either don't comply with code and need to be replaced, or in some cases it's more practical or more efficient for us to replace the components when we replace the generator, and in other cases we need to replace them so that the other components are compatible with the new generator. So this increased scope increased our budget, and following detailed design we had an engineer's estimate of $1.7 million. So I just provided a couple of snapshots here, that's of the building, and a couple of snapshots of the equipment inside the building. So you can see the building is in good shape, and it's beneficial to us to be able to use that structure. Oops. So we put the work out for procurement as an open market bid for construction The low bid was competitive and was below the engineer's estimate. However, this is over the budget that we have included in the 2019 council approved budget. So with this staff report, we're requesting additional funds of $650,000 to complete construction of the works. These funds are available within our wastewater reserves. The reserves were established for asset replacement and for planning for the future wastewater treatment plant expansion. And this project touches both of those elements. We have a piece of aged equipment, and we know that this will continue to be used when we look to wastewater treatment plant expansion in the future. Just as a comment, to improve our process internally as we move forward with other capital projects, within our department, we're going to work with the purchasing officer has an established schedule of tasks that she has related to open market bid tenders, and we're well practiced with her to follow that schedule. And so my recommendation is we add a line item in there where we make sure we check off that we have received an engineer's estimate and that we compare that to the budgeted amount, so that if they're not matching, then we can come forward to council before the tender process. And that's most of the information for you. If there's any questions, or
I think what I will do, Peggy, just because this is a SIC meeting, we'll give the public an opportunity to comment if there's any questions from the public, and then I will canvass council. Any member of the public that wants to comment on this item? Seeing none, then I will look around the table. Council, any questions or comments for Peggy? Councillor Coney.
Thank you, through your worship. Peggy, just curious, is this a requirement by the province? Like, I can understand how it would be a good practice to want something, but does the province lay out requirement?
Through the chair, we are required to have some standby power. So our existing unit would meet that requirement. This is more along the lines of asset replacement, and also, as identified, with our new UV equipment, we can use a smaller unit, which is beneficial to us, like more efficient, less costly for us.
Okay, and then if I understood you correctly, looks like it's gonna be like a rip and replace, it's gonna sit on that same
It's
platform.
gonna go within that same structure, yes, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, council? Councillor Hamilton.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. Just following up on Councillor Coney's question, is there resale value in the generator that comes out, and would we be selling it?
Yeah, through the chair, great question. There is some resale value. So we will put it on and try to sell it, and usually, typically, the manager of facilities does that through gov deals. Yeah.
Councillor Roy, did you hand up?
Yes, I did. And thank you, through you. So you're suggesting on a go-forward basis that we work in some additional controls on the purchasing process. But it seems as though in this case, the issue may have been at the estimation even before we got out to tendering. So I'm just wondering, is there anything else that we can do to improve our estimating? You know, obviously this is work that we need to do, and we're happy to do it, but it's not the first time where we have wound up going quite a bit over what we had anticipated we would go, and certainly that's not best practice. So I'm just wondering if there's anything else that we can do on a go-forward basis to avoid this.
Through the chair, I think that we followed some good steps of the process, right? Like our preliminary review of the load assessment in the fall was just looking at the size of the generator, and it was a very preliminary engineering analysis, and it didn't look far enough into some of those other components that do need to be upgraded, or it's better for us to upgrade and replace them. So I think for us, where we felt we were doing our due diligence to have a preliminary estimate and have that as background for budget, I think we can do better to maybe estimate the extent of the work that might be required. Like just even ourselves with our own knowledge, looking at the feasibility of the existing equipment or the age of the existing equipment, and we could look at that a bit better. What I suggested, at least for us, like to add that line item in the procurement officer's schedule, that would still hit a marker before we go to tender. And if it was kind of like a flow chart of tasks, then we would veer off to the side and say, okay, let's look at this, and are we comfortable? Like staff are comfortable with the scope of the work that is being recommended here, and we believe in that and we support that. So that's why I'm here today. But that's another good question to ask at that time, and it would be before you go to tender, and it would involve doing this, coming to council at that time.
Thank you.
I'm seeing other questions. Peggy, if I can get you to confirm, my understanding is that the water is rate-based, it's not tax-based.
Yes, this is wastewater.
Right.
Rate-based.
So it's rate-based, and so these, as part of our rate-based analysis, we establish a reserve fund going forward to handle equipment updates and eventual expansion to the plant?
That is correct.
Okay, and so do you think that the amount here that we're looking at, does it have any long-term impacts in our reserve and our reserve plans for the wastewater plant?
So as I mentioned, this would be a component we'd be looking at for wastewater expansion as well. So I think that, again, having a new piece of infrastructure that's reliable, a piece of critical infrastructure that's reliable, and we know we're going to continue to use with an expansion. Probably when we look to a wastewater treatment plant expansion, we're going to put in another generator to, if we have more equipment, but we're not going to, we're going to keep this generator. We're not we wouldn't look to replace it to a larger one. We would just complement it.
So it has value moving forward?
Yeah.
Good, thank you, those are my questions. So we have a resolution. And that is that the Strategic Initiative Standing Committee receive and refer the following recommendation to Council. That Council receive staff report PW 2019-15 and authorize an additional budget of $650,000 for a total construction budget of $1.369 million for the wastewater treatment plant diesel generator replacement project. Can I get a mover? Councillor Berman, and a seconder, Councillor Comey. All in favor? That is carried unanimously. Thank you very much, Peggy. So the next item on the agenda, that does it for staff reports. We have public delegations. Is there anyone in the public who would like to comment on any aspect of the SIC agenda tonight? Seeing none, then I will look for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Doherty filling in for Councillor Jeffrey. Good, thank you. Oh, you were there. Seconded by Councillor McLeod. So we will now adjourn the SIC meeting, and we will take a short break of 5 minutes as we set up for the development and operations meeting. Thank you very much.